Hi, everyone. I hope that you're doing well during this time. Um, Today is National Day of Prayer, so I thought I would talk a little bit about um, prayer as we discuss the topic of fear. Um, we are still undergoing the effects of this COVID pandemic, and many of us have just a high level of fear in various facets of our life. And because this is not seeming to go away very quickly, it would really be beneficial for us if we would learn how to manage our fear or eliminate or at least mitigate our fear to some degree. So that's what I want to do on this video is talk about how to deal with fear. I'm going to use a passage from Matthew chapter 26 where Jesus is dealing with high level of distress during a very uh, difficult time when he was in the garden prior to his crucifixion and just right after the Last Supper. We see that he was heavily distressed. I think that this really correlates with some things that we are dealing with now. And it would be really helpful to us to know how to negotiate the area of fear. But first, I want to bring your attention to the fact that the Bible communicates the reality of fear in really two categories. There's really the fear that I would call the biological fear, which is natural to us when we see something that would threaten us, such as a snake or someone in a home invasion or something that threatens our life. That's something that's a fight or flight, kind of activity. But the kind of fear that the Bible addresses oftentimes has to do with the fear that's associated with anxiety or anticipation of a really bad report or a terrible news or anxiety, things of that nature. And really, we are kind of in that category right now. Many of us can say um, or we don't know what the future holds for our jobs or career or perhaps even our family or our health, any of those kind of things. So, what I'm going to do is offer this passage in Matthew. I'm going to talk about that for just a minute, and then I'm going to offer real tangible ways in what we can do to mitigate fear. And these are some things that you can do to take control of what's going on in your life right now. Remember, this is a national or a global crisis, but it's also your crisis and my crisis, individual crises that we are individually responsible for to negotiate and navigate in a way that's positive, so that when we leave this crisis scenario, that our life isn't more devastated than it needed to be because of the pandemic, because the pandemic itself can certainly cause a level of destruction in our lives in many different ways, but we can actually add to the devastation with the decisions that we make right now. So when we get to the end of this, we want to have negotiated it well so that our lives are in a better position to take form in a more positive way, and also with our family and the things that we are doing in our lives. So I think this will be a very important video. So I would encourage you to watch it to the end, because it's I'm going to give you some real tangible things that you can do to begin to work on your self-evaluation to move forward. But as Christians, we certainly want to follow Christ's example. And even if you're not a Christian, you're viewing this, uh, following his example really pays many dividends, because he handled everything in his life in an excellent form. And we get to actually see him in a very distressful time that we hold very precious to our faith in Christianity. And so if it's in Matthew chapter 26, and I'm going to pick up and read in verse 36, and it says, "Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he told the disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' Taking along Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to them, I am deeply grieved and to the point of death. So we really pick up this conversation or this language of deep, dark distress, so much so that he felt death looming on him. And this is a very dark place indeed. And when you are counseling with people, the way they describe their darkness is something like this, oftentimes, if it's really bad. It feels like sometimes death, and some people will describe their crisis and the way it's affecting them as worse than death. You can start feeling the distress that Jesus himself is facing, and his disciples are here, and they are in certain spots you see their distress. But then in verse 39 he says, remain here and stay awake with me. Going a little farther, he fell down, he faced down, and he prayed, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as thy will. And so he, in verse 40, it says, then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. So we see him go back and forth from prayer to the disciples who fell asleep. And this really highlights the fact that Jesus was completely and utterly alone. He did not have a support system at that time. He realized where his true help and source was, which was God the Father. And so he threw himself prostrate on the ground and he prayed very fervently for this cup to pass from him. But when he looked back over his shoulder at those disciples who really should have been some sort of support system for him, they were checked out. They just were not there. And we can certainly perhaps identify with that aspect right now in our lives, because we are living in with a level of isolation where we depend sometimes on our friends and our family to offer physical support, where we could have conversations with them or go out and maybe have some time of visiting with our family and friends that really alleviate some of the fear and anxieties that we have. But now we find ourselves inside of our homes and isolated, and some of us are completely alone. There's no other family members in the home even. So Christ really can understand this place where you are at, because he was there in a very real way, and he was let down by those around him whom he had spent years investing his love and devotion and teaching to them. And during this time he finds that they are not able to support him. So that's the context of where Jesus is. So I want to make a few points, pertinent points here in our situation as it relates to this too, because we have what many have identified as a silent enemy. We have a pandemic that's bringing just a ocean of uncertainty upon us. But not only that, that uncertainty can encompass things very important to us, like our health and the health of our family members and our jobs and our family dynamics in the home. That is under high levels of stress. When you have all of these other perimeter issues going on in our lives that are distressful, of course the home is going to be a hotbed of conflict if it's not handled in a godly or productive or positive manner. And so this is where you come in, and where you can make a big difference in your family and in your life. And so notice that this time period in the scripture is really a 24-hour period in the life of Jesus, where things really get dark and progressively worse until obviously his death on the cross itself. So we are going through a period of crises. So a crisis, and many crises, because of the crisis, right? So, what are some points that we can take away from this and maybe apply to our lives in a real way? Number one, Jesus knew exactly what he had to face, and he oriented himself toward that direction, and he prepared toward that end. So, the first order of business is to acknowledge that a lot of this pandemic, we don't know what's going on. We really don't know what to plan for, and that's why it's such a snake in our life, right? It's such a plague in many other ways, is because we don't know how to plan. And because we don't know how to plan, that can really heap up a lot of anxiety for us. So let's start from what we do know. So Jesus knew what was happening, and he planned he oriented himself to that. I want to make a point here that when he prayed to God the Father, he said, first, he prayed that this would be removed, and that is something that you can do. You can pray that different parts of this could be removed from you, and I would encourage all of us to pray that God would alleviate the plague in our nation and in our world right now. As a National Day of Prayer, we should be praying that and asking for God's mercy to catch us during this time. But also, he was willing to do God's will at the same time. So, first of all, what are some things that you know is problematic for you specifically and for your family that you know that you can prepare for? So grab a journal, or maybe if you're not a journaler, someone who journals, you can get away to your office or outside, go for a walk or some quiet space, and brainstorm about what are some things that you know that you can prepare for that is a problem right now in your life. List those down. And so knowing what the problem is really goes a long way in alleviating some of the anxiety. Second, so also orienting yourself toward that direction. If you know that you cannot avoid what's going on, if there's no answer to the problem, after you've brainstormed that and tried to figure out ways to alter the crisis in your life, and if there's nothing you can do to stop it from happening or anything like that, then orient yourself toward it and decide, this is what I'm going to deal with over the next month or two, and then you can revisit your time frame after the month or two if you want. Is set some kind of a time period that you're dealing with it, and you can always alter that later. And you can even set it forward to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever works for you. Then if you oriented yourself toward that, what that tells you is you have the power to turn yourself toward it and start dealing with it in a more systematic way, instead of pretending that it's not there or ignoring that it's there. That's a very bad way to handle problems, because a lot of people, even during this situation, they are trying to check out any way they can through vices or escape mechanisms so that they don't have to deal with what's going on. They want to just ignore it, but that is a terrible way to deal with problems in your life, because even if they do go dormant for a very small period of time, they come back in a very vicious and savage way, where you have to be dealing with it exponentially. And so it's very important for you to deal with the issue at hand as it comes down the pipeline. So whatever that is, it could be your job preparing for some other thing you need to do. Perhaps you have small or young kids in the home, and it's causing you're trying to work at the same time that you're trying to homeschool and trying to have little kids in the home. There's a lot of that has been going on, and your kids are not going to go away, right? Even if we sometimes wish they were. But so those things are not going away. So at least make a plan and set your expectation according to that plan. So that would look something like, okay, the kids have to be here at home. they have to have some kind of education, and I have to work. So set schedules that will allow for that in their proper place, and prepare for the kids when you're working. Make something that is appropriate level, something that's perhaps hopefully educational and can still capture their attention, and give them some kind of a reward afterwards. But don't overdo it, but don't underdo it. And that way you can segment your lives within the home rather than ignoring the problem, thinking I'm just going to get by for the next little bit and it'll all fall in place. Don't do that, because it may not, and it's going to be 10 times worse a month from now if you haven't created those schedules and those categories and those reward systems and discipline systems for your children and for yourself even. And it would only get worse. Whereas if you make plans now in those kind of categories, in a month or two, you'll be a well-oiled machine at home, and everybody knows their expectations. They know their boundaries. They know what's expected of them, and and that really gives itself to a more harmonious home life, rather than expecting not to have to deal with it, but you're going to have to. See, so that's just one example of preparing. So, of course, I would have to say too that in this whole category of preparing, the bedrock of preparing is prayer. Is that you're praying for your children, you're praying for your husband, you're praying for your wife, you're praying for your church, your leaders in politics, and your leaders in the church, and all of these things. That's the bedrock of preparing. So let's not forsake that for sure. So Jesus prepared, and also when we see Jesus preparing, he really took. If you go earlier in the scriptures, you'll see that he was on the perimeter, on the really outskirts of Jerusalem for a long time, and he moved toward Jerusalem because he was preparing for his crucifixion, and he was preparing his disciples for 3 years in that ministry there. And you always can see him preparing. If you want to read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you have in the back of your mind how Jesus prepared, you'll start recognizing the many ways that he prepared not only himself, but all of those who are around him. And so not only should you prepare yourself, but prepare those around you as best that you can without being controlling about it, of course, right? So preparing goes a long way. Procrastination is an enemy. Just like the silent enemy of the pandemic is an enemy, procrastination is your enemy. It doesn't help you in any way. You can always do small, even almost seeming microscopic kind of activities in preparing, but they really add up. They're cumulative, and they can help you in moving forward. So, also it's important to this is another point, is define what you're fearful of. Get that journal out and start asking yourself, what am I exactly afraid of? So you need to be specific. So let's say, for example, I'm afraid of losing my job. That's kind of a common thing right now. So it's not just you afraid you're going to lose your job. That job represents a lot of categories in your life. So are you afraid of your job loss, or are you afraid of being homeless? Are you afraid of not being able to pay the bills, of providing for your family, or paying for the education for your young adults in college? Be specific as to what that job loss means for you and your family. So that's really important. And you, in whatever category that is, write down what you're specifically afraid of. And if you're afraid of that, and it's in your level, your area of crisis, in your home, in your domain of living, take ownership of it. So that is, like I said, don't ignore it. Ignoring it is not the responsible pathway. And anytime we're not responsible for the things that God has given us to be responsible for, and if we ignore those things, it causes destructive dominoes in our life. I mean, it can be even If God has given us certain talents and gifts that He has blessed us with, and we ignore those and we don't cultivate them, and certainly if we don't cultivate them for His glory or for good in any way, then that's going to have actually a destructive effect on our person, because that is who we are. We are made up of the way God made us. And Psalm 139 tells us that we are fearfully, wonderfully made, that He knit us together in our mother's womb. So if we don't utilize the things that He used to make our personalities, to make our uniqueness and our weirdness and quirkiness and all these things about us that is very unique and different, if we don't utilize the gifts that He has given us, we are actually more miserable as a result of that. We feel better when we are utilizing what God has and cultivating what God has given us in our natural dispositions in things. So don't ignore those responsibilities, even in your person, less on your job, your family, and all these other categories that God has given you to have responsibility for. If you take responsibility for the things that you're supposed to, that helps you personally, it helps your family, it helps your friends, it helps your society, it helps your community, it helps your nation, it helps our world. You literally are making the world a better place when you do what you're responsible for doing. So let's really concentrate on that right now. Also, another point here, a sub-point, is to distinguish between what you're afraid of or what you're fearful of and what others are fearful of. And the reason I say that is because sometimes we are kind of fuzzy on what we're fearful of. We're just afraid. And if we haven't diagnosed ourselves or evaluated ourselves to that, we can actually adopt the fear that someone else has. So it's important to not fall prey to people whose language is laced with fearful verbiage and conversations that really does not lead to a very positive place. And if we're not careful about that, we can adopt that and not only become more fearful, but then we contaminate other people with our fear. Fear is very contagious, actually. This is why it's very important, if you have children, to not have that kind of language, because especially small children, because they cannot connect the dots like you can connect the dots. They can't understand what it means when people are infected, because from their standpoint, from our standpoint, if we go out, if we wear gloves and we have our mask on and we wash our hands, we'll probably be all right. But from their standpoint, if they cannot connect the dots, every time you leave the house, their parents could die. So we have to be careful not to contaminate people, not only with the COVID virus, but with the fear virus either. So make sure that you're not adopting other people's fears, and certainly be sure that you're not contaminating people with fear-based language. Another point is understand why you're afraid. So this would be something you could put in your journal or think about. It is asking yourself some questions like, what are you specifically afraid of losing? People have lost all kinds of things over the last few months. They've lost certainly their jobs. They've lost people they even love to COVID. They've lost their freedom. They've lost their opportunity to worship. Some people would say they've lost their mind because they've been so isolated. There's just a plethora of things that various people have lost during this. So be specific and write down what you think that you have lost and what you will lose. Write that down. What do you believe that, out of that list, what do you believe that you cannot live without? This is a really important self-evaluation, because sometimes we write down what we're afraid we're going to lose, and if we were to be if we were to scrutinize that list in a very objective manner, we could probably negotiate with ourselves and say, I might lose that, but I can live without it. I mean, at the end of the day, I can live without that. And it's not going to be, that big of a deal. It might be some big of a deal, but not a major deal. I can live without it. What do you want that you believe that you can't have? That's an important question to ask yourself, because it's not sometimes what we have lost or what we might think we will lose, but what we want that we can't have that is vexing to us. So it's not only what we lose, but what we want and we think we can't have. And so, whatever the future holds for you at this point, many of us, have been working towards certain goals and they have collapsed. And you're not going to get what you've been working for whatever reason. So, make sure you put that on your list, and maybe you need to, as a result, readjust what you want. Perhaps that would be a very viable way for you to go. Sometimes crisis will provide us with an opportunity to change lanes in our life that when we look back, we would probably see the wisdom in the change that occurred because of this scenario. So really you need to keep your eyes open for the opportunities that are provided you during this lane change, if you will. Maybe God's trying to change you into a different lane and utilize your life in a different way, or it might give you an opportunity to investigate areas that you've always wanted to investigate so that you could, change your profession or change where you live or any of those kind of things. So be aware of that. Now, to discuss about orienting ourselves toward that direction the way Jesus did, he oriented himself, but when we're talking about orienting yourself, we can't just say orient ourselves spiritually or orient ourselves socially. We're a whole person. We're not just a very narrow lane of reality. A whole person has many categories. We have many dimensions in us. We're very complex creatures, very strange indeed. But we have a spiritual component. We got to prepare spiritually. We got to prepare physically, mentally, socially, and medically in our health. So spiritually is kind of what we're doing right now. I'm a soul care counselor, so I do a lot of this kind of counseling, is orienting people, helping people orient themselves from Scripture, because people want to know how to deal with their problems that would be pleasing to God and that would be beneficial to their family and their lives. And so this is what I spend a lot of time doing, is orienting spiritually. So this would be an example of what we're doing today, is orienting ourselves spiritually for sure, but it also carries over into all the other categories within our person. So physically, what does it mean to orient physically? Well, one of the things it would mean to orient physically is to make sure that you are as healthy as you can be, because this is a pandemic, and we want to maybe this is an opportunity for you to start a exercise regimen that would help you to improve your cardiovascular strength and muscle strength and strength in all these ways. And I really want to make a highlight here that research has really shown how much physical exertion and having some kind of a regimen in exercise helps you mentally, mental health and emotional health, and certainly physical health. But they found that if you were able to put all the benefits that exercise has for us into a pill, that we would never be able to keep it on this shelf, because it's just it's unprecedented at the effects of exercise has on your whole person. So if you've not started some kind of exercise regimen, it doesn't have to be an hour long. It just start where you are, do a little something and build up. That really helps you in many ways, and it certainly helps your mental health, and it helps you in scheduling your life. And so when we're talking about the physical, we're talking about literally physically, but also physically making schedules for yourself and having a normal rhythm to your life as much as you can have right now is very important. And the next one is mentally. This is huge. Mentally is to orient yourself is really, really important, because that you talk to yourself more than all the people combined will ever talk to you. You are either your best cheerleader or your worst critic. And it's very important how you talk to yourself. You should talk to yourself in a way that you would talk to people that you love. If you have perhaps a grown child that is struggling in some kind of area of their lives, well, if they came over and wanted to talk to you about the struggle that they're having and what to do, one thing I hope that none of us would do is they would come sit down on your couch and then you would just lay into them with how awful they are and how guilty they are and they deserve everything that they've got. And if they don't do this, then they're going to be ruined. And their lives are worthless and they are useless. I mean, do you see how people talk to themselves that way? Perhaps you're one of those people who uh, browbeat yourself. You would never do that to someone else that you loved, so why would you do it to you? God does not do that to anybody, and He doesn't want us to do it to ourselves, and He doesn't want us to do that to other people because it's devastating. If you had someone, just think about this. If you had someone following you around from the time you woke up to the time you went to bed, just telling you every bad thing about you and adding in lies, hoping you would believe those lies about you, what do you think you would feel like after the end of the day, let's on the end of the week or month or year or 10 years down the road? It would be devastating. So you're very important. You carry the imago Dei. You are created in the image of God. That's what that means in Latin, imago Dei. And your worth is of great significance to God. So don't underestimate that and talk to yourself like you're a real person that has value, not only to yourself, but to the community and to God most of all. You are a very important person. Even if you don't feel like it, you are. And so I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. And so when you're thinking these negative thoughts or these thoughts about yourself like, let's say something, you've lost your job, or several scenarios have gone really wrong in your life because of this pandemic, and it's just like a domino effect to you. Perhaps you're one of those people who have thought, I deserve this. This has been coming for a long time. I deserve everything I get. I'm worthless. I'm useless. I will never be worth anything, or I won't. I'll always be isolated. I deserve to be alone. All those kinds. You see how negative that is. That is futile thinking. The Bible calls that futile thinking. That is not helpful. It's destructive and it's untrue. You dispute those thoughts with thoughts from the Scripture. What the Bible says about you is that you are created in the image of God and that you are worth a great deal to God, very near to Him. He loves all of His creation. And you're not always going to be alone, and it won't always be this bad. When was the last time someone told you during this episode of what we've been going through that it's not always going to be like this? It might be like this for a while, but it won't always be like this. So be aware that you're not always going to be going through this, and you can dispute those wrong thoughts with God's word, and reach out to others that can help you, not hurt you. So that's the mental aspect of it. We could spend several videos on the mental aspect, which I might put some out here in the next month or so. We'll see. Socially, we're craving social activities that we cannot have right now. So let's do the next best thing. Let's reach out to people that we haven't reached out to. Maybe a phone call. If you can do Zoom, host a Zoom meeting with some friends or family members, or with church groups, or with a bowling group, or with a exercise group, or with whatever group you're affiliated with. Start a group even and host that. Do whatever you can do to have that social interaction. We're social creatures. We need each other. And we really need that kind of aspect. And of course, medically, don't forget to take care of your health, your medications, your doctors, keeping that all where it needs to be. So Now, let's move on, and we're going to close up here soon. So, consider the many ways that God has prepared you for what you're facing. So, in your journal, you could write down past events that have prepared you for this time. What has God prepared you for? Think back and how God has prepared you to deal with this type of crisis where you are in your life. I bet if you search hard enough, you would find some things that would really show you that you are better prepared. You're stronger than you realize you are, and you're better prepared than you realize you are. And so, if you just um, give some attention to it and really put your attention in a right lane, a right category in your life, you can really benefit from this time. We want to walk away from this time being better than we were when we went into it. We want to have a progressive evolution of who we are into a better, more God glorifying person than what we went into this COVID pandemic with. So recognize that how God has put you together and utilize that to your benefit and to the benefit of your family. Point two: Jesus's sorrow and extreme anguish was met with prayer and seeking God. This is a time where we really do need to seek God and turn our face toward Him, and He really modeled that for us. So we need to spend some time doing that daily and as much as we can. So let's rehearse just a minute. Jesus turned to prayer. Number one, that's the first thing he did when this time of deep distress came upon him. He turned to God. He prayed earnestly, not just shooting something up to the sky. He really laid out to God, prostrate and earnestly prayed. He asked for the cup to be removed from him, number one, but he also asked for God's will to be done. So God helped him to go through it, not around it or escape it. And some of us will not escape some of the more difficult things associated to what's going on right now, but God can help you to go through the fire. Even if it feels like you don't have the strength, you do have the strength and you can get through this. And also to realize that you may feel alone. Jesus was alone during his darkest hour, but also realize that his darkest hour was actually our greatest light. He really went through the darkness so that we could have life and light in life. This is a dark hour for you, but your darkness can be somebody else's light too. It could be a light for your children, for your friends, for those who are waiting to meet you in the future. We don't know, but we know that what you're suffering right now can be used by God for the greatest good and for benefit for other people. So be aware of that. This is not just your suffering. You're suffering for other people too. I hope that you look at your suffering this way. I'm going to do another video on suffering because so many of us are going through that and have gone through that and will go through that. So let's look at the best positive way to deal with suffering. So realizing these aspects about Jesus, I hope encourages you to know that you are stronger than you realize. And you have a model in Jesus, whether you're a Christian or not, you have a model in Jesus that will help benefit your life. But you have to take the responsibility that is related to you and use these ways and making these lists and setting your face toward them and being proactive and not ignoring and moving forward, whether it's an inch or half inch at a time. Just keep moving forward, because if you're moving forward, you're not moving backwards, right? And we want to have the best scenario come from this time. But we're all going to have stories when we come out of this that we're going to be telling for years and years. We want our story to be a good story, a narrative that is encouraging and uplifting, and something that shows that we've been faithful to God and that we have tried our best and we struggled our most for those around us and not just for ourselves, and that we've cultivated a family life that is calm and loving and conducive to providing ongoing love within the family and not tear it apart. We don't want to be people who are tearing our families apart because we're going through an external crisis or even an internal crisis. This is a time where you double down and you dig in and you do your very best for those around you. You sacrifice. This is a time of sacrifice. You're sacrificing now for what you want in the future. which is a good family, and what you give to the Lord, you dedicate to Him, and you decide that you're living for Him in this way, and that you are doing your very best, it will really help you in the future. So I hope this video is helpful. And when we're talking about fear, if it's been helpful to you, please share it with others because they may need it as well. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. You will get more information as I put these out. And again, God bless. I hope that you're doing well. Take care. Bye.